During a gruesome 5-year killing spree, a predator terrorised North London, murdering at least 12 young men and boys. I'm Matt from Underworld Uncut. Today we're travelling back to February 1983, when one of the most intriguing serial killers in British history was about to be unmasked. Initially, not by detectives, but by a drainage engineer.
The scenes of crime officer managed to pull out 3 or 4 pieces of flesh. And when I looked at them, I thought these bones had probably come from a human hand. So that only meant one thing to me: somebody must have been murdered and flushed down the toilet.
In 2016, we sat down with the late, great, former Detective Chief Inspector, Peter J., the man who caught Dennis Nilsen.
I think one of the things that stood out with him was his sense of humour. You don't really expect a serial killer to be demonstrating a sense of humour when he's showing no remorse, he's showing no feelings about his victims, he's not showing anything.
Peter had no idea what it would lead to when that initial call came in.
I remember a bitter cold day in February 1983. I was sitting at my desk with the most boring task of checking all the CID diaries from my 56 members of staff, and I would have given anything to get away from it. And by chance, my phone rang, and it was the uniform inspector in charge that particular day. And he was up in Cranley Gardens in Muswell Hill. And he said to me, "Could you possibly come up here?" He said, "I've got a bit of a problem. I'm not sure what I've got, but I'd like you to see it." I jumped in the CID car and went up to Cranley Gardens. And he showed me a drain with the cover open. And he pointed out that some bits of flesh had been hauled out of the drain at the bottom, and that they'd been left overnight by a Dynarod plumber to have another look at in daylight, but they'd all gone. So I said, well, let's have another haul around inside the drain, get anything else that's in there. The scenes of crime officer that I had with me managed to pull out 3 or 4 pieces of flesh, each about 4 inches long, 1 inch wide, and 3 little bones with a knuckle at each end. And when I looked at them, I thought these bones had probably come from a human hand. I put the bits and pieces into a plastic bag, and off we went to Charing Cross Hospital to see the pathologist. And he looked at everything there and he said, "You're right." He said, it's human. And he said, "By pure luck, you've brought me a piece of neck and your victim's been strangled." He said, "There's a clear ligature mark on this piece of flesh." And I looked at him and I said, "You sure you've not been watching too much TV, Prof?" And he said, "No, it's as clear as a bell." He said, "This is human." So we went back to Cranley Gardens. I discovered that there were 2 young ladies living downstairs on the ground floor. The middle floor was empty, and the top floor was a fellow called Dennis Nilsen, who worked for Manpower Services and came home every night about 5 o'clock. So I decided that we'd wait until he came home, and sure enough, he walked in the door about 5:15. And I'd had plenty of time to think about how I was going to meet him, because if there's somebody in the top floor who's flushing body parts down the toilet, he's going to be a little bit different. So I decided to treat him very cautiously and slightly light-heartedly, I suppose, because my first introductory words to him were, "I'm Detective Chief Inspector J from Hornsey Police Station. I've come about your drains." And he looked at me and he said, "Well, since when have police been interested in blocked drains?" So I said, "Will you take me up in your flat and I'll tell you." At that very moment, he was fully composed, just reacting normally. There was nothing to think that he was anything other than normal. And we went up to his flat, and you could smell immediately the decomposing flesh. That was crystal clear as we walked in. Even though all the windows were open and it was snowing outside and freezing cold, he kept the windows open, but you could smell it. I said to him, "Look, your drains were blocked with human remains." And he looked at me and he said, "Oh my God, how awful." And I just pushed my face a little bit nearer to his and said, "Don't mess about. Where's the rest of the body?"
The conversation was about to take a sinister turn, as Nilsen made an astonishing confession.
And he said, "Okay, it's in plastic bags in the front bedroom." Even at that point, his demeanour didn't change at all. He was just as he was when he came in the front door. He was okay. Maybe the game's up. And he was relaxed about it. He took us into the front bedroom. There were a couple of wardrobes in there, and he said, "Everything's in there." There was a tea chest as well. And we opened up the wardrobe, and there were plastic bags in there, which he said contained the remains of the body parts. And I just said to him, "Okay, well, we're going to shut this room off. We'll get you back to the police station, and we'll start the forensic side later." So we walked him down to the car. I told him I was arresting him, and he sat in the back of the police car with Steve McCusker, my deputy. We didn't have any handcuffs. So I drove the car back, and then Steve McCusker was obviously thinking to himself about all the body parts that were in so many different bags. And he popped the question to Nilsen, "Are we talking here about one body or two?" And Nilsen said neither. He said, "I think it's 15 or 16. And I can remember the steering wheel sort of shaking in my hands. And it was just the shock of hearing that instant response. And the curious thing was that we believed him. We both believed that he was telling us as it was. We got back to the station, checked him into the cells, and then from there it was a question of getting together with Detective Chief Superintendent Chambers, my boss, and deciding on a plan of action. The whole process was complex because we'd got a fella in custody for murder. We didn't know who'd been murdered. We knew that the clock was ticking and that we had to charge him within 48 hours. And we started off with a quick interview of Nilsen, just to get a summary of what was going on while he was in a good frame of mind, in case he changed his mind at any stage. And he gave us a very, very brief description in an hour or so of what had happened. And then he asked for loads of paper and something to write with, because he wanted to help us by writing everything down in the cells. So we let him get on with that. And then the next morning we were back fresh and early. We had examinations done, forensic science done at the flat in Cranley Gardens. We had the press descending on us from all different angles, even though we had a blackout in the police station. The press were at the front door, the back door, on the phones. They were up on my first floor window of my office. They had a metal bar up against the window with a microphone on it. And it just brought everything to a standstill. Anyway, we had a press conference, a very, very brief one. We just told them something to get rid of them if we possibly could. Then we were able to sort of placate them and promise that we would release what we could when we could. And then we were able to get on with our first proper interview with Nilsen. He didn't have a solicitor present. It was just a straightforward sort of going through a process in chronological order as to what had happened in relation to the last victim. Then we had told him that we were going to go through one victim at a time, one victim per interview, because we knew it was going to take at least 2 hours per victim, because we had to get everything possible from him so that we could identify the victims. A lot of them we didn't have bodies for. So he was able to tell us nicknames. Occasionally he would give us a name. He would give us a description.
Nilsen's crimes had begun more than 3 years earlier, starting at a different address in Cricklewood, northwest London.
In relation to the 12 murders at Melrose Avenue, where he'd burnt all the bodies, we were able to find bits and pieces from his garden, which we would use to attribute to victims. To give you an example, there was a camera part there, and we were able to link that to Kenneth Ockenden purely because his parents came over from Canada. Nilsen would tell us that he had murdered a young man of about 20 years old who had a tattoo round his neck, and he'd strangled him, and he'd give us a full detailed account of how it all happened. But we had absolutely no idea at all as to who he was talking about. You can't really charge a prisoner with killing a person unknown. You need to prove that somebody has been killed. We had to be absolutely sure that when we named a victim, it couldn't possibly be anybody else. That was a mammoth undertaking.
Police launched one of the biggest searches in UK history. But this time, they weren't looking for the murderer. They were looking for the victims.
Jeff Chambers and I decided right at the beginning that I would be building the best professional working relationship with Nilsen whilst he was in custody, because we were 100% reliant upon what he was telling us. We needed his assistance. If we came up with an idea as to the possibility of the identity of one particular chap, and we got a photograph, we needed Nilsen to look at it and say yes or no. And we wanted to maintain the honesty that he was actually showing. So it was very necessary for me to treat him as, not as a mate, but treat him kindly, treat him nicely. He used to call me Gov, I used to call him Des. That's how it worked. When we went to court for the remands, I would probably go down into the cells, the back of the court, and give him a newspaper and a bar of chocolate. That'll seem odd to some people, but that's the way it had to be. We had a most unusual situation here. We had a murderer in custody, serial killer. We didn't know who he'd killed. We hadn't got a clue. And we weren't going to find out unless we got the truth out of him. We got total cooperation from him. So it was an unusual way of working. And of course, in those days, we didn't have all the luxuries that they have nowadays. We didn't have DNA to rely on. We didn't have anything. We had a mouth that could ask questions. We had fists to knock on doors. And that's how it was. I think right at the very beginning, I probably thought to myself, I've got a right evil bastard here. I'm going to have to watch this one.
Hiding in plain sight, Nilsen was able to carry out his reign of terror, seemingly unnoticed.
He got away with it at Melrose Avenue because he was disposing of the bodies in-house and having these bonfires in the middle of the night, like funeral pyres. And on the top of those bonfires, he'd put rubber tyres to destroy the possibility of the smell of flesh, burning flesh, oozing out. He covered his back completely while he was there. He had to do that because he didn't drive a car. He had no means of moving the bodies. And at Cranley Gardens, of course, he had the same problem. He had to dispose of the bodies in-house. And I remember him telling me that for one of the victims, he was removing the flesh from the bones and flushing that down the toilet and then putting the bones out in plastic bags for the dustman to take away. He was going to great lengths to dispose of the bodies. For instance, he had a massive size saucepan. He could get a whole head in a saucepan, boiling it and then breaking up the bones. And of course all the flesh was going down the drain, getting flushed away, never to be found again. It was pretty good until it all went wrong when he blocked the drains up. He put too much down one day, and that was where it all started. That was the beginning of the end for Dennis Nilsen.
A mild-mannered civil servant by day and a serial killer by night. Dennis Nilsen was a monster, hiding beneath a veneer of normality.
I think what's probably terrifying about this case is the fact that Nilsen was so ordinary. You begin to think to yourself, how many more of them are there around? How many more Dennis Nilsens are there who are disposing of the bodies of their victims never to be found again. I remember at the time of the interviews staring at him, trying to ponder why. And I still don't know the true answer. There was nothing unusual about him at all until he got into private conversation. And then he would bore the pants off you with talking about prison rules and union rules. I think you'd really expect a serial killer to be highly dangerous. But with Nilsen, we were able to relax. His demeanour was such that I had a peculiar thought while he was in custody that I could actually walk out of the police station with him and go to a restaurant and have a meal and walk back to the police station with him. We were in a situation where he was beginning to think that he was glad it was all over. He was beginning to trust me. And indeed, that became very apparent years later when he asked an ex-ITN newsreader if he would do an autobiography to raise money for victim support schemes. And we met up and he laughed. He said to me, "This is what Nilsen's asked me to do." He said, and funnily enough, he's asked me to get in touch with you first before I see anybody, because you're the only person that he really trusts. And I thought, well, that's very odd, isn't it? I'm trusted more than anybody by a serial killer. Bizarre. And I just joke about it to this day. I think, well, perhaps I should put that on my CV.
Throughout questioning, Nilsen failed to show any remorse for his grisly actions.
There was one point that he certainly said to us, "Enough's enough. If you hadn't caught me now, it wouldn't have been 15, it would have been 150. And I think he was probably right, actually. I think nothing was going to stop him unless he was caught, and that was the end of it. And I think at that time he said to himself, this could be the end of it. During all of the interviews, he showed absolutely no change in his demeanour. He showed no remorse. And in fact, he wrote on a piece of paper and gave it to us that it surprised him he had no tears for my victims, no tears for myself or those bereaved by my actions. There was no remorse. He actually asked me one day, we were in the court, down in the cells, and he looked at me and he said, "Gov, do you know why I did this?" And I said, "No, I'm waiting for you to tell me, waiting for you to give me some indication as to what it's all about." I said, "The only thing I can think of is that you were looking for somebody to share your life with." And he wasn't sure. But he wasn't sure about his sexuality, really, because I asked him about that at one stage. Homosexual? Or bisexual? Or heterosexual? He was a loner. And he told me that he tried a night with a Swiss au pair girl once, and he said it did nothing for him at all. So he said, I thought I must be perhaps gay, but I think maybe he was just asexual.
Dennis Nilsen was charged with 6 counts of murder and 2 attempted murders. Despite his lengthy confessions, Nilsen's defence team decided to plead not guilty to all the charges against him.
The defence wanted to plead guilty to manslaughter on the grounds of diminished responsibility. We weren't happy about that at all, because we had a psychiatrist from King's College in London look at him in depth, and he said he couldn't find any evidence of a personality disorder at all. Now, to have a personality disorder, you have to fit into a box. Each box is labelled psychopath, whatever, and each condition has its own identifiable symptom. And of course, Nilsen didn't actually fit into any one of the boxes. So the defence called 2 psychiatrists, and one was saying that he's sane as far as I'm concerned. One of the others was saying he's definitely got a personality disorder. And the third one was saying, after cross-examination, I should point out. Do you know, I really can't make up my mind. So we still had a draw, and it was left to the jury to decide whether or not he had the capability to form an intention to kill, and he was found guilty of murder on all counts.
Dennis Nilsen spent the rest of his life behind bars. He died of natural causes in May 2018, aged 72.
He was just very, very different. I've never met anybody like him before in my life. I couldn't really get to understand him. I mean, you deal with people as police officers, and you mentally stick them in the evil bastard box, or the sort of cry for help box. There's always a box you can stick them in your own mind. But Nilsen, I never got to the bottom of. I couldn't understand at all. That's why it's so different. People often ask me how the country reacted to Nilsen. And you know what? I don't really know. I was so busy, I was so absorbed in this case, that for 9 months I was having to eat, sleep and drink it. I had to focus on it because there was so much to it. We had to get it right. And do you know what? I think we did get it right.
Former DCI Peter J died of cancer in February 2018. He was 79. We hope you enjoyed this deep dive into the capture and conviction of Dennis Nilsen. Thanks so much for joining us. Please do subscribe to the channel and give us a thumbs up down below.
Young ladies had been attacked in the street and hit over the back of the head. The risk was, because he attacked it as a blitz attack, we could have another murder, but we can't prevent it.
In the early noughties, nightclub bouncer Levi Bellfield attacked at least 4 innocent women across West London and Surrey. His youngest known victim was just 13 years old.
Nothing ever matters to Levi apart from Levi. And when you combine that with somebody who's got a kind of sadism and kind of propensity to use violence in the way that he has, you've got a really dangerous mix.
This is Matt from Underworld Uncut. This week, we're speaking with former Detective Chief Inspector Colin Sutton about how he and his team captured the infamous bus stop killer. When did you first get involved in the case?
Well, I got involved when Amélie Delagrange was murdered in August 2004, and I got the phone call to say there's been a murder and we'd like you to investigate it from my bosses. So I went over to Twickenham police station and learnt that Amélie was a French girl. She was 22 years old. She'd been living in Twickenham, near Twickenham Green, working as a waitress, and she rented a room. She had a boyfriend who was another French man, and was generally enjoying life in London. She had been in Twickenham town centre doing a bit of shopping, then met up with some of her friends on the night she was murdered, and she got the bus from Twickenham town centre to Twickenham Green, and for whatever reason she missed her stop. And we know from the driver that she sort of said, well, I've missed my stop, what time's the next bus back up? And he said, oh, it's 15 minutes. And it was a nice night in August, and she thought, oh, it's not very far, I'll walk. And you know, that was her fateful decision. Had she waited for the bus, she may well have been okay that night. And at about 10:15, there's a young man walking around Twickenham Green and found what he thought at first was just a bundle of rags or a bundle of clothes, but turned out to be Amélie, and she was lying there on the grass. Her shopping bag with her shopping in was next to her, and she had a single wound across the back of the head, was bleeding profusely. He called for an ambulance, and she was taken to hospital and died an hour or so later of this single wound, which had caused a catastrophic sort of fracture to her skull and a brain injury.
What were your initial steps into finding Amélie's killer?
The first thing that was a line of inquiry that needed looking at was the fact that the team that were on duty during the night, that were first called out before they handed it to me, had contacted the mobile phone company and asked them where Amélie's mobile phone was, because it wasn't with her, her handbag wasn't with her. And they were able, from the phone company, to get the information that her phone had switched off from the network, had been lost by the network, if you like, at Walton-on-Thames at a particular time. Well, this time was something like 8 or 9 minutes after she was found dying on Twickenham Green. And Walton-on-Thames is a considerable distance away, and it pointed to the bag with her phone in it having been taken away by somebody in a vehicle. So virtually the first thing we did was to plot, a map between Twickenham Green and Walton-on-Thames Bridge, where we know that the phone was last on the network. I want to grab all the CCTV that there is there, and we may not even look at it for months. But when we get somewhere on this investigation and we know what we're looking for, we can go back to it and see if we can find it. It had all the kind of characteristics of a completely random attack, and they're often the very hardest to investigate, because not only do you not have the links to help you, but also they're quite often those murders that are pre-planned. And when people pre-plan murders, they tend to think about DNA and fingerprints and things, and all the things that we can use in most murder cases. And these are the thoughts that are going through my mind as we're looking at the first few hours. As we looked at that, we were conscious that there had been a number of similar attacks in the area over the preceding sort of 18 months or so. One of those was the murder of Marsha McDonnell.
Who was Marsha McDonnell?
Marsha was a 18-year-old girl. She'd been to the cinema in Kingston with her friends, had got a bus home, and she was murdered between the bus stop and her house where she lived with her parents. She was murdered 50 yards from her front door. That had been investigated by another team in the Homicide and Serious Crime Command, and their investigations had led them to a 16-year-old youth who wasn't in the best of mental health, to put it mildly, and really wasn't competent to be charged or even really interrogated about the offence. And as a result, he was sectioned and was put into to some sort of institution. And although he hadn't been charged with the offence, everybody kind of thought, well, it was him, and so we can put that offence to bed, and we've solved that, if you like. Then, of course, when Amelie gets murdered in the same way, in the same sort of circumstances, in the same sort of area, the first thing we did was to say, well, where was this 16-year-old last night? And the answer was he was securely locked up in somewhere in the northeast of the country, so it couldn't have been him. So either it was wrong and he wasn't Marsha's killer, or we had a copycat. Either way, we had to then include Marsha's murder into the investigation into the death of Amelie that we were already undertaking. Marsha was killed with a single blow to the back of the head with a heavy implement. We never found out what that implement was. Looking at the pathology and the type of wound that she sustained, it was obviously something very heavy and very hard, probably with a square edge, and that was virtually the same as the wound that was inflicted on Amelie Delagrange as well. We can't say it was the same implement, but it could have been. Marsha was found on the street where she lived, 10 or 15 doors down from her parents' house. The local resident heard a noise, heard a whimpering, if you like, and called police, and she was found there with this terrible head wound, and she was taken to hospital and died 2 or 3 days afterwards. She was unconscious from the time of the attack, yeah. She wasn't able to help us at all.
Were Marsha and Amelie the only cases you investigated?
There had been other similar attacks in that sort of area. There was another 16-year-old schoolgirl that she was thought at first to have slipped over in the snow and banged her head. And it was only then when Marsha was murdered that police looked at this occurrence some 2 months previously and realised that could have been an assault as well. And the interesting thing was that the women that survived fell forwards. The two that died, Marsha and Amelie, fell backwards and were found on their backs. The ladies that survived had no recollection at all of what happened. They just, said, I was walking along, and the next thing I knew, I woke up in hospital some hours or some days later. So we didn't have any kind of clue or sighting that led us towards the suspect for it, because they just simply couldn't remember it. There was certainly a striking physical similarity between most of the victims. They ranged in age between sort of 16 and 32. They were all blonde or blondish, and I guess all of them were well dressed and were quite kind of sophisticated, looked quite well off, rather than perhaps some of the other people in the street. There was a kind of a type there.
When was the breakthrough in the case?
I got a team that was consisted of 6 officers. As a result of that, they did a fantastic piece of work where they spotted that there was this little white Ford van that appeared, sat next to the green at a place, 60 yards from where Emily was found. And it was there for less than 8 minutes and drove away again. And, that becomes something of great interest, because why? Why would somebody be there? It was on the south side of the green. There were no shops, there were no garages or anything else, a pub or anything like that would cause somebody to park there for a short time. As the weeks progressed, they found 20 or 30 sightings of this van, separate bits of CCTV. And that's when we built up the picture of this van circling Twickenham Green effectively and driving around for a period of something like 45 minutes before Emily was murdered. We had to try and identify who was in it. So we looked at it and everybody thought it was probably a Ford. So we phoned up Ford and said, do you have somebody there who could look at our pictures and confirm that this is what we think it is? And they said, it's a courier produced between September 1995 and 2002. And this all sounded really good and really positive. We could narrow the field down. And then we realised there were still 25,000 of those vans in the UK, registered in the UK, that we needed to try and look at. There was no, or very, very little, automatic number plate recognition in those days. And that's how we had the spectacle of, 4 of London's finest murder detectives standing on a bridge over the A316 taking car numbers. And that was probably the lowest point of the entire investigation for me, because it was kind of one of those situations where I'd sunk everything into identifying this van, and it kind of wasn't working. And I was left back at the office at Barnes, as we were then. A woman came into the mobile police station and she suggested it was her ex-partner, and that man was Levi Bellfield. Once we'd identified who he was, we wanted to try to find the white van. It was decided that Bellfield was going to be put under surveillance 24/7 in the hope he'd lead us to the van. During the time he was under surveillance, one Sunday afternoon, was when he went and had a conversation with 2 young girls at a bus stop and asking them questions about their sex life. And they were like 14 and 15. And the surveillance team did absolutely the right thing. And when he left them, they got on a bus. And when he left them, the surveillance team peeled off one car which followed the bus. And when these 2 girls got off the bus, they spoke to them. And that's how they know what the conversation was about. And they made a statement. And after 10 days, and we hadn't led us to the van, we arrested him at his home address in West Drayton. He'd been seen to go in there at about sort of 3 a.m. by the surveillance team. He's hiding in the loft. So I've then got the problem that you need to try and get somebody out from a loft who you want for killing people by hitting them across the head. And of course, the first thing you do when you're trying to get into a loft is put your head up through the hatch, isn't it? And so I decided that probably we needed some officers with helmets and shields and possibly even a dog, and put a dog up there first of all, and that would be the way to do it. And I'm frantically trying to arrange those sort of resources and assistance like you do, and the phone rings again, and the sergeant says, don't worry, we've got him. So I said, how have you got him? He said, I just went up the ladder and arrested him. I said, oh, okay, you're very naughty. You shouldn't have done that, but thanks. And he was arrested, and he was hiding naked under the fiberglass loft insulation in his loft, which must have been pretty uncomfortable, I would have thought. But he said to us, I was only hiding because I thought it was a gang. I thought it was, somebody after me. Well, it was somebody after you, Levi, but it was the murder squad.
What was Levi Bellfield charged with?
He was arrested for the murder of Amelie, the attempted murder of another lady in Twickenham, and an attack on a lady who we think he assaulted in Hampton Road near Twickenham Green in 2002 or 2003. We didn't have enough evidence to charge the other things. Levi's then partner, the woman he was living with at that time, had 3 children with. She started making the disclosures about the abuse and sexual abuse and violence that she'd suffered at his hands, and realised that this was her opportunity to break away from this, abusive, violent relationship that she had. And so she did, and she had great courage. Not only were we able to charge him with the offences against her, but she also said, well, his two previous partners, I've spoken to them, and they suffered the same. And we went to them and they confirmed that. From that day, the 20th of November 2004, he never saw the light of day again.
What did you learn about Levi Bellfield?
Levi's ex-partner, she tells stories of him sitting on a stool in the kitchen and saying, you're not to move until I come back, and she'd spend literally hours there. She'd wet herself while she was there because she was so frightened to move. I mean, other partners told us about him locking them in the house and takes the key away so they can't go out while he's away. We get the report we've had, which says, my ex-partner Levi Bellfield is a very violent man. He has got a hatred of women, particularly blondes. I found a magazine where he stabbed through all the photographs of blonde girls in it. He's very weird, and it's just the sort of thing he'd want to do. And he now works as a wheel clamper and uses a little white van to do it. So, that's exactly what we're looking for, somebody who's got a small white van. And what had happened, when we were looking at the Ford Courier vans that were registered in the local area, one was registered to a garage in Isleworth. And it just so happened that officers had been to see the garage, and he'd said, oh no, I don't have that anymore. He said, that's I sold it. I sold it to a guy called Levi. I didn't get a second name from him. He said, but he left a mobile phone number and gave me an address. So I asked somebody then to get me an intelligence printout, what was known about Levi Bellfield, every sort of contact he'd had with police. And one of the times that he was arrested was in May 2004, when he was arrested for kidnap, which was kidnapping the landlord of a pub near where he lived in West Drayton. And the crucial thing was, and that abduction took place indeed, in a vehicle, and that vehicle was a white Toyota Previa. That made me sort of take notice because I'd looked at the case of Kate Sheedy.
Who was Kate Sheedy?
Kate was the head girl at her girls' school in Twickenham, and she'd been with a load of school friends to Twickenham Town Centre on the day that they finished doing their school lessons before they took their final A-level exams. And Kate left on a bus, went home on a bus, much like Marshall McDonald did, much like Emily did, went on a bus back to her mother's home in Isleworth. She got off the bus to walk a few hundred yards back to the house. And as she did so, she's walking along the road and she's aware up ahead of her was a people carrier that was sitting parked with the engine running but the lights off. She crossed the road. She heard this people carrier start up, accelerate, and it literally did a U-turn, came across the road and simply ran into her, just ran her over. And she ended up on the road between the front wheels and the back wheels of the people carrier. It then reversed, so the front wheels went over her body again and drove off. And Kate sort of crawled onto the relative safety of the pavement, managed to find her mobile phone and call 999 herself. Kate's offence was being investigated by the borough, the local detectives, because it wasn't a murder, because she'd survived. That's how the system works. But we were aware of it, and officers on my team had said, we ought to have a look at it just in case. Although it's similar in its outcome, and it's similar in the area where it took place, and the age and the victim and what she looks like and all this sort of thing. It's just the weapon, substitute car for hammer, and it's the same. And we found out that Levi Bellfield had a Toyota Previa at that time. That Levi Bellfield had been arrested in May, the same month that Kate Sheedy had been attacked with a people carrier. There's Levi Bellfield being arrested in a people carrier. I got somebody to go and do a check on the number plate of the Previa that Levi had been arrested in and said it was white. And I remember her saying to me, Governor, I think we might have hit the jackpot. And she was right, because we now had somebody, Levi Bellfield, who had the right kind of white van that was used at the time Amélie Delagrange was murdered, and the right type of vehicle at the time that Kate Sheedy was run over. After we'd arrested Levi, it's about 4 months after Amelie was murdered, but we took responsibility for Kate's case.
What was it like meeting Bellfield in custody?
I extended a hand to say hello because you need to have a relationship with these people, even if they're murderers or whatever. You need to or something. And he just pulled his hand away and said, "Fuck off, prick." So I thought, okay, fine. That's how we're going to be. That's going to characterise our relationship for the rest of this investigation. And it did. Initially, wanted to talk to us and wanted to protest his innocence and spoke to us, and which quite surprised me. And he had a solicitor there, and the solicitor said, "No, if you want to speak, you should speak to the officers, Levi." So he did, and he started denying things, but he was talking to us and denying them. And what happened was that we then had the allegations made by his partner that he'd abused, assaulted, sexually assaulted. But when she'd been the victim of domestic violence from Levi, she'd used the same solicitor that was at the police station to organise her splitting up with him and so forth. And that meant there was a conflict of interest, and that solicitor couldn't represent Levi as in the criminal proceedings. So we had to get the duty solicitor, and that was the end of Levi talking to us. The new solicitor advised him to make no comment, and he made no comment of virtually every other question that was asked of him. But interestingly, I say that, but you could engage him, occasionally you could engage him, often by showing him documents, maps, photographs, things like that. And he found it difficult to resist. He wouldn't just sit there and not look at them. He'd take them and look, and then he'd start speaking. And he almost did it in a way, he realised then that he'd spoken, he wasn't meant to speak. I think secretly he wanted to talk. I don't think he wanted to talk because he wanted to admit anything. He wanted to talk because he thought he would get the better of the officers that were interviewing him. Nothing ever matters to Levi apart from Levi. Or possibly his mother. But certainly not his children, his girlfriend, his wife, partner, or anyone else. He'll have thought it through and thought, how does Levi Bellfield come out of this with the best outcome? How's this most beneficial to me? And when you combine that with somebody who's got a kind of sadism and kind of a propensity to use violence in the way that he has, and he's quite a physically large person as well, then you've got a really dangerous mix. I had the honour, in some ways, the dubious honour of formally charging him with my offences. And it's to have stood across the table and looked him in the eye and sort of laid out what he was accused of was a very kind of special moment for me, because we'd put an awful lot of work into this. But you look across the table charging him, and he's just got these coal black eyes, there was just not a flicker of emotion. Never was a flicker of emotion with him.
What was Bellfield's MO?
As we got into the investigation with Amelie's murder, there's good reason to suspect that what happened in these cases was actually Levi Bellfield was making some sort of verbal approach from his car, and it was when he was rebuffed on that's what flicked the switch in his head. That's what triggered the assaults. We've got good reason to think that from the timing of Amelie Delagrange's walk, and where Levi Bellfield must have seen her on that walk, and how long it took for her to get from there to the next camera where we know she was. So we're pretty sure that she stopped to speak, and she was engaged by Levi on the street like that for Kate's case. The only thing we can think is that Bellfield is in the car. We subsequently found out, looking at CCTV, Levi Bellfield has trailed her in the bus for some miles. Of course, buses are all lit up inside, aren't they? When they get to stops, they light up even more at night. So it's easy to see in through the glass, through the windows, and see who's in there. And it looks like he sort of selected her as a potential victim. When the bus stops and she gets off, he must have overtaken her. And we think he was probably, it's the same story. He wanted to make some kind of approach, advance verbally to Kate as she passed the car. Now, whereas in the case of Marcia and Amelie, that advance is rebuffed and that causes him to react violently, it didn't even get that far with Kate, because Keith thwarts him by walking onto the other side of the road. And it looks like this is the trigger. You think, oh, that clever, do you? And so you have an attack that's grounded in the same desires and the same kind of method, really, although the weapon is very, very different.
What happened at the trial?
The court case started in October 2007. It lasted for about 5 months. And I was there every day apart from one. Levi thought he could talk his way out of anything, and he thought he was going to talk his way out of this. There was no fingerprint, there was no DNA, there was no picture of him with the weapon or anything like that. But the case that we'd put together gave him very little chance to come up with an excuse. And we had 65,000 documents we had to disclose to the defence. And Levi was in the dock sitting behind us, and he's very respectful to the judge, and when the jury are in, and yes, your ladyship, no, your ladyship, and so forth. The second the jury were out, the second the judge was out, he would be making faces at Amelie's parents. He would be talking in a stage whisper to people and saying unpleasant things about police officers or the victims. It's a thoroughly nasty piece of work for our trial. In February 2008, we had half a dozen victims whose cases had never been before the court, never would, who turned up to see him get sentenced and see him go away forever. There was another series of offences where Levi Bellfield committed rape, drug-induced rape on teenage girls between the ages of 13 and 16. And there were 5 offences that I'm happy we could have proved. And the CPS sort of said, look, we can't add them to the indictment for the murders because it gets too complicated for the jury. But what we did was we got all the victims, all the young girls and the other victims of his offences that we couldn't charge, and we kind of brought them into the family almost and said, look, it's just not possible to charge him with every single one of your offences. But what we want you to do is to realise that the most important thing for everybody is that this man goes to prison forever. And actually her justice is your justice. Her justice is your justice. And we had this kind of fair network. The jury were out for a number of days, week and a half, 2 weeks. And eventually we got word that there'd come some verdicts, and they had found unanimously that he was guilty of murdering Amelie, and by a majority that he was guilty of murdering Marsha and of attempting to murder Kate. The rather odd thing was that there were 2 other offences on the indictment where we had direct evidence, an ID parade, identification and an eyewitness. They were the ones the jury couldn't agree on. The 3 offences where we just had circumstantial evidence and where the cross-admissibility of evidence supported, the 3 cases supported each other, they were the ones that we got convictions on. But that's juries for you. The sentence was put off the next day. We all knew and guessed he would get whole life tariffs because that's what he had to get. He refused to come out of his cell. He wouldn't come up and hear what the judge said about him, wouldn't be up in court there actually to be sent down to start his sentence.
What was your reaction to the verdict?
All the emotions you can think of, relief, that you've done something that you've wanted to see happen, that you'd kind of rehearsed in your mind so many times that this is how it's going to end. You're just so relieved for the families who've got justice. It never brings back their loved ones. Of course it doesn't. It's the very best you can do for them, but it's still hopeless, really, in some ways. And then I got called into the witness box by the judge as well to be commended, and for me and the team to take her kind of commendation. And it was it was one of the most emotional moments of my life, really. It really was. And it's just a job, really, isn't it? But it's not. It's so much more than that when you invest. And it wasn't just me. When my team invested so much of their life, so much of their lives and their working lives into this one investigation, it was one of the most indescribably intense emotional feelings when we finally got there.
Were there other victims?
The link was being made by the media and by the public because Amelie's phone was found at Walton-on-Thames, which of course was the last place Millie Dowler was seen. At that time, we didn't realise that actually the link was Levi Bellfield, who lived in Walton-on-Thames and actually was involved with both. Millie was walking home from school, having got off a train, walking back past a bus stop. She wasn't going to get on a bus. She was walking past a bus stop, which was literally just outside Levi's house. 20 minutes later, Levi's girlfriend's car, the red Day next year, is seen driving out of the road where he lived and not seen coming back again. And Millie was found 6 months later in woods in Hampshire. And you know, the interesting thing about that is it's always with Levi somewhere where he's got an attachment. He's got, you know, he went back to Walton-on-Thames and threw Emily's things into the river because that was where he used to go fishing. And Minley Heath Woods, where Millie's body was found, is somewhere that Levi was used to going with his girlfriend's show jumping. There was a show jumping venue there. Millie Dowler's abduction and murder was a Surrey police offence and investigated by Surrey police. I told Surrey police in 2004 that we'd identified Levi Bellfield as the suspect for our offences and that I knew he lived 20 yards away from where Millie was last seen at the time she was abducted, and given that he ought to be looked at. And from that day on, in kind of late 2004, early 2005, we were talking to Surrey police and the Operation Ruby and Millie Dowler investigation team. I think it was 2007 they first interviewed him for the Millie Dowler offence, and he no commented. And they were tenacious with it, Surrey. You know, they carried on and carried on. It wasn't until 2010 that they charged him with that offence. And it was very much like our investigation into Amelie and Marsha's murders and Kate's attempted murder. There was no forensic evidence. There was no smoking gun anywhere. They had to build a case with what people had been saying, with little facts, with phone evidence. But the whole thing came back to us knowing what Levi Bellfield had done on the night that Millie Dowler was abducted. He was convicted of Millie Dowler's murder. He did it again. I'm sure that Levi Bellfield's responsible for many, many more crimes than we kind of accept that he is. Whether there are other murders he's committed that we don't know about, I'm not so sure. There were very few offences of blitz attack offences of women being hit on the back of the head by strangers in London, and all but one of those that we found we could reasonably put down to Levi Bellfield. He was ruthless, he was violent, he was sociopathic, I'm sure. So who knows what else he might have done.
On the 25th of February 2008, 39-year-old Levi Bellfield was given 3 life sentences for the murders of Amélie Delagrange and Marsha MacDonald and the attempted murder of Kate Sheedy. Over 3 years later, Bellfield was issued another life sentence for the murder of Millie Dowler. He is currently serving his whole life tariff at HMP Frankland.
It's confirmation that their loved one was abducted, murdered, and secretly buried. All too often, people don't know what actually happened, how their loved one became to be in this grave in the middle of nowhere.
Ian Brady and Myra Hindley, otherwise known as the Moors murderers. Between 1963 and 1965, they lured 5 children to their deaths. They tortured and sexually assaulted them before burying at least 3 of the children on Saddleworth Moor.
Would you believe, just a few centimetres below the surface, we realised straight away that we'd hit something. I got down on one knee with an archaeological trowel, a pointing trowel, and almost instantly found a white stiletto shoe.
I'm Matt from Underworld Uncut, and this week we're speaking to former Detective Inspector Jeff Knupfer. In 1985, some 20 years after the initial investigation into Ian Brady and Myra Hindley, he reopened the case to try and find out what really happened to 2 missing children.
I was just a young kid at school, I think, when this first broke in 1965. Really didn't know more than anybody else did, other than read it in the paper and see it on television. But I think it certainly shocked Manchester. I mean, it was It was an horrific crime, or an horrific series of crimes, and it stunned everyone. No two ways about that. I think A, because it involved children, B, it involved a woman who was supporting or being involved had been involved in these events, and thirdly, of course, it was just after capital punishment had disappeared off the statute books, and there's no doubt about it in my mind that had these two committed these crimes a few years earlier, they would both have been hanged. There's no doubt about that whatsoever. I think the Hindley and Brady investigation had really been filed away on the basis that they had both got life sentences. It was generally accepted that neither of them would ever be released. The head of CID at the day was a guy called Peter Topping, Detective Chief Superintendent, and he had taken the decision to undertake a review of the Moores case because of the two missing children, Pauline Reed and Keith Bennett. The decision was taken in 1966 by the powers that be that they wouldn't pursue these two cases. They'd been filed as no further action. I'm not sure that was appropriate, and it certainly wouldn't happen today, that is for sure. Peter quite rightly decided that we ought to have another look at the case. And I was tasked, along with a detective sergeant, of working to him, reviewing the case and making recommendations on how we could take the case forward. So I was very fortunate because there was a guy more senior to me who was also in that group, and as luck would have it, he got removed and taken off to another inquiry. So I kind of jumped up a leg, I suppose. So I've always considered myself very fortunate to end up in the position that I did on this inquiry, which was number 2 on it, of course. We recovered all the documents from the original inquiry, which were held by Cheshire Police, and we spent months going through all this, just two of us, going through all this paperwork, obviously in day-to-day contact with Peter Topping, head of CID, and obviously then going to try to find these witnesses who'd given evidence in the trial in the 1960s or provided information in the 1960s, trying to contact them, trying to locate them first and foremost, and then go and pick their brains again about what they thought, what they did, how they viewed the situation, and whether there was any intelligence or evidence to implicate Brady and Hindley in the cases of Pauline Reed and Keith Bennett. In terms of the missing children, obviously we tried to find the original missing person files, which were originally produced by Manchester City Police, a force that had long gone by that stage, and really went back through the details in those files, and then trying to connect them and the locations they had been with, I suppose, a form of geographical profiling, looking at where the kids were when they were last seen around and where Brady and Hindley might have been. And clearly there were geographical connections. Pauline Reed was a neighbour of Myra Hindley and her family, and Keith Bennett lived not too far away from Gorton, where clearly they were operating, and at some stage Brady was certainly associating with Myra Hindley, and I think probably stayed at the house as well. I think we were all pretty content that there was certainly strong suspicion that Brady and Hindley were involved in the disappearance of these two children. You know, really, where do we go from there? We talked to an awful lot of people. We also talked to the prison authorities, and we talked to the hospital authorities, because Brady had, by that time, been moved to Park Lane into the hospital or the health channel rather than the prison channel. And they started talking to us about how we might best deal with the matter, how controlling these two individuals were, and how we might overcome that problem. So those were the sort of conversations we were having. We were also looking at the deposition sites on Saddleworth of the 2 children who were murdered and buried, and also where we believed that Edward Evans' body was bound for had Brady and Hindley not been arrested. The decision was taken to go to interview Hindley at Cookham Wood Prison. Hindley didn't know we were going. Only the prison governor knew we were going, and we were going to come out. The plan was to come out of the prison and say that we had interviewed Myra Hindley, not discuss the details obviously of the discussions, but then let Brady, scratch his head as to what had happened within that prison interview with Hindley. Everybody told us she was highly intelligent, she was controlling, and she would move heaven and earth to get what she wanted out of this. She was by far the more controlling character at that stage, because obviously Brady was suffering from serious mental problems. And I guess that is what influenced us in the way we progressed this case. We thought we would go and talk to Myra Hindley and get that out of the way, because we wouldn't get anywhere. We knocked on the door, the governor met us and took us in, and he asked Hindley, obviously she was oblivious to all this, he asked her if she would see us, and she said yes. And straight away it became clear that this was a cordial meeting and a positive meeting. And it came as a total surprise to us. We'd been advised by everybody we'd spoken to that she would bat all this off and not engage. She did just the opposite. She was very helpful, very engaging in what we wanted and what we were looking for. We found out very quickly that the mother of Keith Bennett had written to her, and she suggested that had influenced her thought processes in some way, some significant way. So I think we picked by accident, we picked our timing very well indeed. And very quickly in that first conversation, she started talking about pointing out areas of interest to Ian Brady on Saddleworth Moor. We stopped the process pretty quickly, because there was just obviously Myra Hindley and Peter and myself there. We arranged to get her solicitor, who was based in London, to come along that same day, and then the 4 of us sat in a room and chatted about this. And at the end of that, we had this agreement for her to highlight these areas, and these are her words, not mine, these areas of interest to Ian Brady on Saddleworth Moor, which was, I guess, kind of code for saying, I'll give you a hint as to where the bodies are buried. So we were pretty confident fairly early on that we were going to make progress in this case. She then said at that meeting that she was prepared to visit Saddleworth Moor and point out these points of interest to Brady. And to our frustration, and contrary to what we'd agreed, her solicitor left the prison and went and told the press that Myra Hindley was prepared to go to Saddleworth Moor and point out these sites of interest to Ian Brady. So that's really when the balloon went up, and everybody but everybody was waiting for Myra Hindley to go back to Saddleworth Moor and point out these locations. We approached the whole thing very cautiously, but I mean, there's no doubt about it. We were very enthusiastic about her response, amazed by her response. We were going there really largely as a formality, with a view to putting pressure on Brady. So this was a process we were going through, and we were absolutely flabbergasted when she said she was prepared to help in one form or another. Peter Topping had interviewed Ian Brady in Gartree Prison quite early on when this review was launched in 1985. I hadn't seen Brady at that stage. Apparently he was very ill, and the psychiatrists and medics that we spoke to, hospital staff we spoke to at Park Lane, said that he was ill, and I think there was a suggestion from some people that, you know, if we timed this well and we brought the right sort of psychological pressure to bear, we might persuade him to confess to all this. That really didn't happen at that stage. Ian Brady was very, very difficult. I think, you know, first and foremost, we've got to say, this guy was seriously, seriously mentally ill. He was an intelligent man, but a very controlling character, and made life difficult at every turn. You know, from personal experience, you could go and meet him in prison, agree one course of action with him, and then by the time we'd got back to the office, that had all changed, and he'd written a letter to somebody or he'd phoned somebody, and was just, I mean, an impossible character to deal with, really difficult. I think, you know, just to make the point that both of them had denied everything in their 1966 trial. They had not admitted one solitary aspect of the offences they were charged with. So, you know, there was plenty of territory for him to move, but Peter Topping spoke to him more than I did. Peter went quite a lot whilst I was looking after things on Saddleworth Moor on occasions. I mean, he found him just utterly impossible. He was trying to make deals about, well, I will tell you all about this if you give me means whereby I can kill myself. And one of the other ones he came up with was, well, I will tell you all, I will spill the beans, I will tell you about all this if you let me have I suppose you could describe it as a week out. He wanted a few days out where he could have alcohol, watch films, and generally, and food that he chose. So they were impossible demands, really, but quite bizarre, frankly. I'm pretty comfortable with the thought that Brady was a psychopath. He suffered from schizophrenia, and he was a very sick man, and clearly a very violent man, and I'm sure he would have killed in one way or another, regardless of Hindley's involvement. I've never come across anybody like Brady or with that level of illness, medical illness or psychiatric illness, who could do and say these things. This combination of weird behaviour combined with this controlling and highly intelligent approach, very, very unusual, if not unique, certainly to me anyway. We saw her in the spring of 1986 at Cookenwood Prison, and over a period of 3 days she made a full confession under taped conditions and under caution, of course, to all of the offences. That's not just the offences they were convicted of in 1966, but also the murders of Keith Bennett and Pauline Reed. The 3-day confession process was complex and very, very time-consuming. We went through the whole process informally, first and foremost, and only after that did we start the taped, recorded and confession under caution. And again, the 5 of us were there. Myra Hindley, her lawyer, her advisor, her religious advisor, and also Peter, of course, and myself. She was able to say when Leslie Ann Downey was murdered, she was in the bathroom drawing a bath of water and was later presented with a dead child. So these were the sort of accounts she gave, and I guess we'll never know the exact truth of who is right and who is wrong. She fully accepted her part in all this and understood quite clearly that had she not helped Brady, gone along with Brady, these children would not physically have gone with Brady, and he couldn't have abducted them. So I think she was under no illusions as to the seriousness of her part in all this. Once she had said that she was prepared to point out areas of interest to the police, and of course her lawyer had told the media that she was prepared to go back, we came under an awful lot of pressure from the media, really, and others, to get her back to Saddleworth Moor. We applied to the Home Office and they agreed to it, but they imposed very strict conditions on how we might take her back there. Those conditions proved disastrous, really, in many ways, because it became a media circus. The conditions imposed by the Home Office meant that we had to close the moor, we had to close the road, we had to get up there by helicopter, and we had to have an escort. And there were, the conditions were imposed were quite ludicrous, really, and clearly by somebody who had no idea what walking on Saddleworth Moor was all about. I mean, one of the conditions was that she would be handcuffed to a prison officer at all times. And I'm sure anybody who's been up there will know that just walking, you know, with 2 free hands is difficult enough, let alone being handcuffed to people. Fortuitously, we had somebody there from the prison department with a bit of common sense and immediately dropped that precondition. We'd shown Hindley over the various visits we had, mapping, photographs, aerial imagery, all sorts of things about where the remains might be buried. So we were pretty confident that we had 2 graves, and pretty soon she was giving us broad hints as to which one was which. We got her onto the moor. We transported her up from prison by helicopter. The weather was appalling on that day. We'd commandeered a quarry as our working police station. We've got a mobile police station there, and all our staff were there. And we moved out from there to go onto the moor. We had highlighted 2 areas that we felt could be the burial locations of the 2 children. One was Hoe Grain and Shiny Brook, and the other one was on Hollinbrown Knoll, where Leslie Ann Downey's body had been found. We visited both locations. She had a great difficulty in getting her bearings with Hoe Grain and Shiny Brook, simply because we came at it from a route other than the one that she would have taken to it, or they did take in the 60s. And that caused consternation at every level. We then moved to Hollinbrown Knoll, and instantly she got her bearings and she was able to give us some indications as to where the grave might be, or the areas that were of interest to Brady might be. It was on the way back to the quarry where we had our mobile police station. We passed a bridge that runs where Hoe Grain runs under the road, and she pointed out through the window and said, "That's where we used to park the car." Now, this was something we weren't aware of, obviously. So we immediately thought, well, yeah, we've got this wrong. If we'd approached it from there, she would have got her bearings. And really, that was I guess, the basis for the second visit. We knew that we'd got it wrong, that she hadn't got her bearings in the morning when we'd looked at Hoe Grain and Shiny Brook, and we really ought to try that again. And we took her back to Saddleworth Moor and did the job the way she wanted it done, or she had asked for it to be done, and it made eminent sense, really. I think the problems, the difficulties we encountered the first time round were we had to comply with the rules and regulations set out by the Home Office Prison Department in how we cared for Hindley and how we managed the visit. The second time, I think even they had realised that they'd got it wrong, and they gave us absolute control of how we managed the visit. So we brought her up to Saddleworth Moor by car. We hired a camper van and we visited the various sites really under her control, or her direction, so that we were able to stop where she wanted us to stop. We were able to look at things from a position that she wanted to look, and it worked remarkably well. So she took us to where she believed, certainly in Hoggrain and Shiny Brook, where Keith Bennett was murdered and secretly buried. And also, of course, at Hollinbrown Knoll, where Pauline Reade was murdered and buried. We'd started searching that year at Hoggrain and Shiny Brook for Keith Bennett. The weather in the early summer was excellent, and we were able to get a lot of work done, and then the weather turned, and we had days and days of torrential rain. And really, we were flooded out of the area that we were searching. So we moved to Hollinbrown Knoll, which is a higher point and better drained, and started looking for Pauline Reade. And I think it was on the 1st of July of that year, whilst we were basically line searching into the bog, into the peat moor. And as we were doing this, one of my colleagues said, "Oh, there's a patch of ground there that looks as if there's no vegetation on it. It looked odd, it stood out." But this was a few metres beyond where we were actually digging at that moment in time. And we thought, well, why not? We'll just give it a quick look. I think, unfortunately for Peter Topping, he was at the hospital talking to Brady on that day, so I was there with the rest of the team. And would you believe, with just a few centimetres below the surface, we realised straight away that we'd hit something. I got down on one knee with an archaeological trowel, a pointing trowel, and almost instantly found a white stiletto shoe. And of course we knew that Pauline Reade was wearing a white stiletto shoe at the time she disappeared. We were on the moor, the press were camped out on the road, and we really didn't want to let them know about this development. So we stayed on the moor for a little longer, all sat round and had a cup of tea and patted one another on the back. I mean, you know, fantastic success as far as we were concerned, but also tinged with the sadness that what this would mean to the family. And then I left two of the guys on the moor to obviously mine the body, and we all tromped off the moor, and the press didn't, thank goodness, hadn't counted and didn't know how many of us were on the moor and how many came off. So we left two of the guys there. We couldn't use mobile phones because they were being monitored by the press. So we then drove to the nearest police station, and I rang Peter on a landline and told him that we'd found Pauline Reade. Peter Topping told the family later on. I think the difficulty is at that stage, you can't prove conclusively that this is Pauline Reade we've found, albeit it's 99-point recurring certainty that it is Pauline Reade. So Peter told her father that there had been a development and human remains had been found, and that in all possibility or probability they were those of Pauline Reade. Being able to return the remains of a loved one to the family so that they can go through whatever process they want to go through, it is so important to people because it gives them that one word, that closure. It gives them somewhere to visit. They can go and put flowers on a grave, whereas at the moment they don't know where those remains lie. So I think at that level it is relief for them, but I suppose conversely it's confirmation that their loved one was abducted, murdered and secretly buried, and that must have a profound effect on them also, because all too often people don't know what actually happened, how their loved one became to be in this grave in the middle of nowhere. We were still looking for Keith Bennett's grave, and we'd never know until we got him there whether he could locate it or not. We went straight up there in the early hours of the morning, got him onto the moor. Brady and Hindley used to park their car on the bridge where Hoggrain runs beneath the A635, and we took him to that point on the morning that we took him there, and we set out from there to walk down Hoggrain and then onto Shiny Brook. He strode out very purposefully initially, but when we got to Shiny Brook, when we got to the confluence of the two streams, he started to hesitate and clearly couldn't get his bearings and started suggesting that things had been moved. I mean, you know, quite a bizarre suggestion to make. But nothing had been moved between the 60s and the 80s. I'm absolutely 100% satisfied. He didn't know where it was. Had he known where it was, he would have told us, I'm sure. He'd certainly taken us to the same area that Myra Hindley took us. So I think we've always been satisfied that Keith Bennett was taken to that area, was murdered there and buried there. At the end of the physical search, we had to prepare a file of evidence for consideration by the Director of Public Prosecutions and the Attorney General. Our recommendation was that these two should not be charged with the additional murders of Keith Bennett and Pauline Reed, because the only winners would be the media. You know, they were both in prison, they were both serving life sentences, and the chances of them, either of them getting parole was very remote. Around that point, Peter Topping retired from the police service, and whilst the case had effectively been put to bed, there were still aspects of it that were running. So I continued as the sort of proxy senior investigator, if you want, for some years, and kept in touch with Myra Hindley, or more correctly, Myra Hindley kept in touch with me, the other way around, for some years after that. But I moved on, progressed within the police service, and then moved to a post in the Home Office in London in the 90s, and I retired in 97. You know, it's engraved on people's brains in Manchester. I think it's just local, and people know the points, know the locations that are talked about, know where the locations where or the areas where the children were abducted, and it seems, I guess, personal in some way to a lot of Mancunians. And you know, perhaps it will stay that way for years to come yet, until another generation, till the generation dies off and we start again.
Ian Brady and Myra Hindley were never formally charged with the murders of Keith Bennett or Pauline Reed. Keith Bennett's mother, Winnie Johnson, passed away on the 18th of August 2012 without ever finding out where her son was buried. Myra Hindley died on the 15th of November 2002. She was 60 years old. Ian Brady died on the 15th of May 2017. He was 79 years old. Thanks for watching this deep dive into the final chapter of the crimes that shocked Manchester and the world, the Moors murders. This is Matt from Underworld Uncut. Please remember to like, hype and subscribe. It really helps the channel.